The red silk was a wound against the snow. It was the only thing of color in a world of white and gray, a flash of impossible defiance that caught the eye and held it. Josiah saw it from the ridge, a collapsed bloom of crimson at the base of a skeletal pine. He thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a blood trail from a wounded buck. But the shape was wrong. It was too soft, too still. He urged his horse forward, the animal's breath pluming in the biting air. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman, small and slight, curled into a tight ball against the trunk of the tree. She wore a dress of brilliant red, a garment so fine and out of place in the Wyoming winter that it felt like a hallucination. Her black hair was dusted with snow, her face turned away from the wind, pale as porcelain. For a long moment, he thought she was dead. Then, a faint tremor ran through her. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep powder. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that stole the breath and burned the lungs. He could not imagine how long she had been out here. Hours, at least. He knelt, his movements stiff from the cold and a life of hard riding. He touched her shoulder gently. She did not respond. He shifted his position, trying to see her face. It was young, impossibly so. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against her ashen skin. He saw the truth of her then, not just a woman, but a girl, and one of Chinese descent, a rarity in this isolated stretch of country. He had seen a few in the railroad towns, but never out here, alone, dressed for a wedding she had clearly never reached. There was no time for questions. The sky was spitting flakes again, the kind that promised a blizzard by nightfall. Leaving her was a death sentence. He was not a man given to charity, nor to company, but he was also not a man who would leave another soul to freeze. He gathered her up. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile weight in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest, a faint, chilled breath ghosting against his wool coat. He carried her to his horse, settled her in front of him, and wrapped his own coat around her slight frame as best he could. The ride back to his cabin was slow, the wind a constant, keening thief. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, straight to the hearth. The embers in the stone fireplace glowed faintly. He laid her on the bearskin rug, her red dress a stark slash of color against the dark fur. He worked quickly, his hands sure and practical. He stoked the fire, adding kindling until small flames licked at the logs. He filled a kettle with water from the bucket and set it on the hob. He found his thickest wool blanket and wrapped her in it, tucking it tight around her. He chafed her hands, feeling the life, faint but present, begin to return to them. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment, filled with a profound and weary terror. He stepped back, giving her space, his large frame casting a long shadow in the growing firelight. He was a big man, his face weathered by sun and wind, a dark brown cowboy hat shadowing his features. He wore a simple red checkered shirt and a gun belt that was as much a part of him as his own skin. He knew what she must see, a stranger, a threat. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Get into my cabin, it's freezing outside." It was an order, but not an unkind one. It was the first thing he had said to her. She watched him, her gaze traveling from his worn boots to his guarded face. She pushed herself up slowly, the blanket pooling around her. The warmth of the fire was beginning to penetrate the deep chill in her bones. She sat there for a long time, silent, while he moved about the small, one-room cabin, his motions economical and quiet. He poured hot water into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it with trembling hands, the metal warming her fingers. He expected tears, or questions, or perhaps just a grateful silence. He did not expect her to look him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and unnervingly steady, and ask her question. Her voice was quiet, but her English was perfect, without a trace of an accent. It was her first words that made him freeze in shock. "Will you sell me?" Josiah stopped. The ladle in his hand, halfway to the stew pot, hung suspended in the air. He turned his head slowly to look at her. The question was not hysterical. It was not a plea. It was a practical inquiry, delivered with the calm acceptance of a woman who understood her place in the world as a commodity. It was the bleakest thing he had ever heard. It spoke of a life so far removed from his own solitary existence that he could barely comprehend it. He saw the man who had abandoned her, not as a faithless groom, but as a trafficker. He saw the unspoken horrors that had led her to this cabin, to this question. He put the ladle down with a soft clink. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, tightened. "No," he said, the word a hard stone in the quiet room. "Sit. Drink the water." The cabin was a testament to a life lived alone. And Fen, as she told him her name was, took it all in during the long silences of that first day. There was one chair, made of pine and worn smooth with use, pulled up to a small, rough-hewn table. There was one tin plate, one cup, one fork. A narrow cot was built into the wall, covered with a patched but clean quilt. On the mantel above the fireplace, next to a box of cartridges and a whetstone, sat a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. It was the only object in the entire cabin that seemed to hold any softness, any memory of a gentler hand. Josiah was a man made of routines. He rose before the sun, built up the fire, and went out to see to his horse. He chopped wood with a steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to be the only conversation he was willing to have. He cleaned his pistol every evening, the metallic scrape and click of the parts a familiar sound in the quiet. He ate his meals quickly, his eyes on his plate, and rarely spoke unless a question required an answer. And Fen understood this language of silence. It was a language of walls, of things left unsaid. She saw the shape of a life that had once been larger. The cabin was built for two, she realized. The pegs on the wall held one coat, but there was space for another. The single chair was pulled up to the table, but the table was large enough to seat a second person without crowding. The grief in this house was not a ghost, it was an emptiness, a carefully maintained void that Josiah lived around. For 2 days, she did little more than huddle by the fire, regaining her strength. Josiah gave her his cot, taking the bearskin rug for himself without a word of discussion. He shared his food, thin venison stew and hard biscuits, placing a portion before her and then turning away. He never asked how she came to be in the snow. He never asked about the red dress, which she had folded carefully and placed in a corner. He gave her one of his old shirts and a pair of trousers to wear, and the fact that they swallowed her small frame hole seemed to go unnoticed by him. On the third morning, she rose while he was outside. The cabin felt cold and still. She saw the small pile of his mending in a basket by the hearth, a shirt with a torn cuff, a pair of socks worn thin at the heel. She found a needle and thread in a small tin box on a shelf. Her hands, no longer trembling, went to work. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of such precision that they were nearly invisible. She did not know how to chop wood or hunt, but she knew this. This was a language she could speak. When Josiah returned, the scent of wood smoke clinging to him, he saw the mended shirt folded neatly on the basket. He stopped, his eyes lingering on the cuff. He picked it up, running his thumb over the fine, strong stitches. It was a woman's work, the kind of patient, careful mending he had not seen in years. He looked over at Fen, who was sitting quietly by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look up. She did not seek praise. She had simply seen a task that needed doing and done it. He said nothing. He simply hung the shirt on its peg, the repaired cuff facing inward, like a secret. This began a new kind of silence between them, one of a quiet and steady exchange. And Fen began to fill the empty spaces in the cabin, not with noise, but with purpose. One small thing at a time. She took over the cooking, stretching his meager supplies with a skill that bordered on magic. A handful of dried herbs she found hanging from a rafter, combined with a few wild onions she unearthed from beneath the snow near the cabin, transformed the bland stew into something savory and warming. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom, tidied the shelves, and brought a sense of order to the masculine clutter. Josiah watched her. He never commented, never offered a word of thanks, but he saw everything. He saw the way she banked the fire at night so the embers would last till morning. He saw the way she cleaned the tin plates until they shone. He saw the way she talked in a low, soft murmur to the cabin's other occupant, a fat, sullen grey cat named Cinder that usually tolerated Josiah's presence with an air of profound disappointment. The cat had ignored Fen completely for the first week, viewing her as an unwelcome disruption to its routine of sleeping and glaring. And Fen, in turn, never tried to pet it or coax it near. She simply moved around it, acknowledging its presence with a quiet deference. One afternoon, as she was preparing their meal, a small piece of salted meat fell to the floor. She nudged it with her toe toward the hearth, where the cat was pretending to be asleep. One of Cinder's eyes opened a crack. A pink nose twitched. After a long, dramatic pause, the cat rose, stretched with agonizing slowness, and proceeded to devour the offering. It then sat, washed its face, and stared at her as if to say the matter was settled, but no precedent had been set. Josiah saw the entire transaction from the doorway. He had been trying to win that cat's affection for 3 years with no success. A few days later, Fen was sitting on a low crate by the fire, patching one of Josiah's blankets. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the world they were shut away from. She felt a weight on her legs. She looked down. Cinder had leaped silently onto her lap, circled 3 times, and settled into a purring ball of fur. Her hand stilled. She looked over at Josiah, who was sharpening a knife at the table. He had seen it. A corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen from him. The cat had chosen. The dependent had softened. It was a small victory, but in the profound quiet of the cabin, it felt momentous. The thaw was not just in the cat. It was in the air between them. The silence was no longer heavy with questions and suspicion. It was becoming comfortable, a shared space. They began to exist together, 2 solitary people forming an unlikely household of 2. He still said little, but his actions began to speak for him. One day he returned from a trip to the distant trading post with not just flour and salt, but a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. He set it on the table without a word. Inside, Fen found a bag of rice, a luxury she had not seen since leaving her home. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a simple thing, a sack of grain, but it was an acknowledgement. He saw her. He understood. That night, the smell of steaming rice filled the cabin, a scent of a life she thought she had lost forever. His reciprocation continued in these silent, practical ways. He noticed her shivering one evening, despite the fire. The next day, he spent hours outside, and when he came back in, he presented her with a pair of thick, warm moccasins he had stitched together from deer hide and lined with rabbit fur. They were large, but they were a world away from the thin slippers she had arrived in. Another evening, he sat by the fire, not cleaning his gun, but carving. The knife moved with a surprising grace in his large, calloused hands. He worked for hours, the shavings falling onto the hearth. When he was done, he had fashioned a second cup from a block of birchwood, sanded smooth and fine. He placed it on the shelf next to his own tin one. There were 2 cups now. The cabin was no longer a place for one. He also brought back a newspaper from the trading post, weeks old but still a connection to the outside world. He would read it by the firelight, and sometimes he would leave it on the table. Fen began to read it, too. Her English was good, but book-taught. The newspaper was different, full of the plain, hard language of the West. She learned new words, new phrases. And it was there, in the dense columns of print, that she found the first sign of something wrong. It was a small article, tucked away at the bottom of a page. It concerned the rapid expansion of the Union Pacific Railroad and the acquisition of land for a new spur line through the territory. It listed the names of the local agents and surveyors. One name leaped out at her, Mr. Finch. The man who had brought her from San Francisco, who had promised her a wealthy husband, a new life. The man who had left her to die in the snow. She read the article again, her heart a cold knot in her chest. The railroad was buying up homesteads, paying well for some, but running into trouble with others. The article mentioned a particular parcel of land, belonging to an old homesteader named Miller, which was a critical piece of the planned route. Miller, the paper noted, had stubbornly refused to sell. He had died of a sudden illness just a month prior, leaving no heirs. His claim was now in legal limbo, ripe for acquisition. And Fenn's mind raced. Finch had brought her to this area to marry a man she had never met. He had shown her a photograph of a prosperous-looking ranch. He had told her the man was a landowner. What if the intended groom had been Miller? What if Finch's plan had never been about marriage at all? A Chinese bride, appearing on the doorstep of a stubborn old bachelor, would have been a scandal. It would have been leverage. It could have been used to discredit him, to force him off his land. But Miller had died before she arrived. Her purpose had evaporated. She had become a loose end, a problem to be discarded in the nearest snowbank. The arithmetic of it was cruel and simple. She folded the newspaper carefully, her hand steady despite the tremor inside her. She said nothing to Josiah. She filed the information away, a small, cold piece of a puzzle she was just beginning to understand. The winter tightened its grip. For a week, the snow fell without pause, a thick, silent curtain that erased the world. The cabin became an island in a sea of white. The wind moaned around the eaves, and drifts piled up against the door, reaching halfway to the roof. They were trapped. Josiah had a good supply of firewood stacked against the cabin, but the storm was relentless. The world shrank to the four walls of the small room, the flickering light of the fire, and the sound of the wind. Josiah grew restless. He was a man who needed the horizon, the feeling of open space. Being confined chafed at him. Against Fenn's quiet words of caution, he insisted on checking his trap lines, convinced the storm was breaking. He returned hours later, empty-handed, his coat and hat encrusted with ice. He was shivering violently, his face pale and drawn. By nightfall, he was burning with fever. He lay on his cot, caught in a delirium, muttering names she did not recognize. A woman's name, Sarah, was repeated like a prayer. The cough that seized him was deep and rattling, a sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. And Fenn knew this illness. She had seen it in her village. It was the lung fever, and it could kill a strong man in days. The roles were now completely reversed. She was no longer the rescued, but the rescuer. All the quiet competence she had shown in small domestic tasks now focused into a sharp, determined fight for his life. She remembered the lessons her grandmother, the village healer, had taught her. She had seen him use yarrow to treat a cut once. She knew there was a small supply of dried herbs in a pouch on the shelf. She brewed a bitter tea, forcing it past his lips a spoonful at a time to break the fever. She kept the fire roaring, using their precious wood unstintingly. The cabin became hot and humid. She bathed his face and chest with snowmelt, trying to cool his burning skin. She sat by his side through the long nights, listening to his ragged breathing, watching the rise and fall of his chest. In his delirium, the walls he had so carefully built around himself crumbled. He spoke of a wife, Sarah, lost to a fever just like this one, in a cabin just like this one, during their first winter on the claim. He spoke of a small, carved bird he had made for her. And Fenn looked at the bird on the mantel. The grief in the room finally had a name. For 3 days, he hovered between life and death. And Fenn moved like a ghost, her small frame fueled by a fierce, protective energy. She rationed their dwindling food, cooked broths he could not eat, and never stopped tending to him. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a blinding glare on the new-fallen snow. And inside the cabin, Josiah's fever broke with it. He woke to the smell of rice and the sight of Fenn, asleep in the chair by his cot, her head slumped forward. She looked exhausted, but she was there. He was weak, his body aching, but his mind was clear. He remembered flashes of the illness, of her cool hands on his forehead, of her persistent voice urging him to drink. He had been through this fire once before and lost. This time, someone had pulled him out. He sat up slowly. The movement woke her. Her eyes opened, dark and concerned. "You are awake," she said, her voice soft with relief. "How long?" he asked, his own voice a raw whisper. For days, she said. The storm has passed. He looked around the cabin. He saw the diminished woodpile, the nearly empty sacks of flour and rice. He understood the cost of his survival. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a stray he had taken in, but as the woman who had saved his life. Her quiet strength was a force of nature, as powerful as the blizzard that still held them captive. "Who taught you?" he asked, the question a substitute for the gratitude he did not know how to voice. In the quiet that followed, as he slowly regained his strength, she told him. She spoke of her grandmother, of the herbs and remedies passed down through generations. And as the silence between them had finally become the right kind of silence, the kind that could hold a story, she told him about Mr. Finch. She told him about the photograph, the promises, and the article in the newspaper. She laid out her theory, her voice calm and logical. She was not asking for pity or for help. She was simply stating the facts as she understood them. Josiah listened, his expression grim. He had known men like Finch. Men who moved in the respectable world of business and law, but whose work was done in the shadows, using people like Fen as disposable pawns. He believed her. Every word of it. Just as this new, fragile trust was settling between them, a sound came from outside. A horse, struggling through the deep snow. A sharp knock on the door. Josiah reached for the pistol on the table, his movement slow but deliberate. And Fenn's heart hammered against her ribs. Josiah opened the door a crack. A man stood there, well dressed in a thick wool coat and a fine hat, his face pink from the cold. He was smiling, a warm, pleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Josiah Coulter," he asked, his voice smooth as oil. "My name is Finch. I believe you have something of mine." His eyes slid past Josiah to Fen, who stood frozen by the hearth. His smile widened. "Ah, there she is. I've been so worried. I've come to collect my ward and take her to her new home." Josiah's large frame blocked the doorway. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice flat and cold. Finch's pleasant demeanor did not falter. He radiated a calm, respectable menace. "Now, Mr. Coulter, let's not be difficult. I have a contract here, a legal bill of sale for her passage and placement. She is, for all intents and purposes, my property until her contract is fulfilled. I understand your desire to play the hero, but harboring her is tantamount to theft. The law is on my side." He was weaponizing concern, twisting Josiah's act of decency into a crime. He was certain of his power, of the piece of paper in his hand. He expected the backwoods homesteader to be intimidated, to yield to the authority of a man from the city. But it was Fen who spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension in the small cabin with the clarity of a bell. "You are mistaken, Mr. Finch." She stepped forward, holding the folded newspaper in her hand. She did not look afraid. She looked composed, dignified. Josiah shifted slightly, a silent, solid presence at her side. "Your contract was with a Mr. Miller," she said, her English precise. "You intended to place me in his house to create a difficulty for him, so the railroad could acquire his land. But Mr. Miller died. Your plan failed." Finch's smile finally vanished. He stared at her, his composure cracking. "That's a ridiculous accusation." "Is it?" And Fen continued, her voice steady. She laid the facts out, one by one, with the simple, devastating logic of the truth. The timing of Miller's death. The railroad's problem. Her own convenient abandonment when she was no longer of use. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her quiet certainty was more powerful than any shouted accusation. She held up the newspaper. "It is all here, for anyone who can read." Finch was deflated. He had been seen. His scheme, so carefully constructed in the shadows, had been laid bare by the quiet girl he had written off as disposable cargo. He looked from her calm face to Josiah's unyielding one. The gun in Josiah's hand had not moved, but its presence was a final, unspoken sentence. There was no leverage here. There was no profit. There was only exposure. He stammered, offering a weak denial, but his authority was gone. With a final, venomous glare, he turned and trudged back to his horse, defeated not by violence, but by plain dignity. When he was gone, the silence that fell was different from all the silences that had come before. It was the silence of an ending, and of an unanswered question. And Fen went to the corner and picked up the small bundle she had made when she first arrived, containing the red dress. Her exit, kept ready. She had brought trouble to this quiet man's door. Now that the trouble was gone, it was time for her to go, too. She was a loose end, and she would not be a burden. She walked to the door, her heart a heavy, aching weight. She did not want to go. This cabin, with its quiet, wounded man and its sullen cat, had become the only home she had. But she had been taught to ask for too little, to expect nothing. She put her hand on the latch. Stay. The word was quiet. So quiet, she almost thought the wind had spoken it. She turned. Josiah was standing by the table. He had not moved, but his face was changed. The guard was down. The walls were gone. He said her name for the first time, not as a label, but as a person. And Fen. Stay. It was not a command. It was a plea. A question. An offering. It was the word he had been unable to say for years, to the memory of the woman he had lost. It was the word that rebuilt his world. And Fen looked at him. She looked at the 2 cups on the shelf, the mended shirt on the peg, the warm moccasins by the fire. She looked at the empty space at the table that was no longer empty. She let her hand fall from the door. She walked back into the room, set her small bundle down, and began, one small thing at a time, to unpack. Thank you for watching.